So when we ended off the last topic, one of the things we looked at was the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte to the leadership of France in the 18th century, right? So Napoleon Bonaparte began his career um, as a war leader, right? So Napoleon was born in a small island called Corsica, or off the French south coast in the Mediterranean Sea. And Corsica had many sort of incursions by the Italians, the French, and others throughout in its history. But Napoleon's family was a French family. They spoke French, and this, in many ways, guides a lot of his life. He sees himself as French, and he sees himself as a person who identifies with the French nation. And this will become a big piece of that, right? So he joins the French military, and he works his way through different ranks, and ultimately winds up as a colonel. He has a very successful military career. This helps to catapult his political career. So in the late 18th century, he becomes a member of the Directory. And as a member of the Directory, he's a member of that five-person group that helps to pacify the nation. Now, the problem with the Directory was that it was an anti-democratic group, right? Because there are so many people, they don't want to give people the right to vote. There's five people who make decisions, and that really becomes the piece of it. So in 1799, Napoleon and two other members of the Directory orchestrate a coup d'etat, and they overthrow the Directory, and ultimately establish Napoleon as what is called the first consul, and they establish the consulate. This is, in many ways, a harkening back to the Roman Empire, but it's a way for him to also sort of start to establish himself as a major political figure. And through this, one of the things that Napoleon does as the leader of the country is he ultimately winds up, declaring himself consul for life. In a lot of ways, he's trying to bring back the ideas of Julius Caesar and, as I said, the Roman Empire. So, as the leader of France, he starts to make some very significant political reforms and enlightened reforms. Now, it is wholly unenlightened to be the first consul for life, right? That is not an Enlightenment idea. Democracy is, liberal ideas are. So Napoleon is really this interesting mix between an enlightened figure and a person who wants to bring back sort of the glory of the past. One of the ways in which he passes or muses these ideas of the Enlightenment is through the Civil Code or the Napoleonic Code. One of the big objections during the French Revolution, and I hope you remember, is that during the French Revolution there was a lot of concern over different treatment of peoples based on their class in society. And in order to stop that, there are things such as the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. There's the Civil Constitution of the Clergy. There are things that are there to try and restrict the power of the aristocracy and the power of other groups. So one of the things that people objected to when Napoleon came to power was that there hadn't been a more formal piece of legislation, piece of law that would give or provided protection for every group of people across the board. So in 1804, or in the years before 1804, Napoleon comes together with legal scholars, with lawyers, with judges, with educated folk, and to come up with nearly 2,000 different codified pieces of law. A lot of them dealt with private property and protection of private property, but a lot of them dealt with other things as well. And it was a way to establish and secure people's rights. Now, I say that, but I also should point out here that it was not 100% egalitarian, right? There was limitations put on women. Husbands had complete control over the wages of their wives. Children, it was the same, right? The income of the children was also the same. So it was not as if this was, this sort of great Enlightenment peace, but it made equality before the law, right? Aristocracy didn't matter anymore. Other reforms that Napoleon puts into place, sort of again stripping away the rights of aristocracy, is that he encourages a meritocracy, right? Careers could be based, or should be based, excuse me, on a person's specific talents. So your work in the government was not one of nepotism, was not one of the person who's hiring, but rather given on the skills that a person may require. Napoleon also believed extremely ardently on religious freedom. He had seen the problems that France had come under in the sort of Catholic era of France, the sort of discrimination against French Protestants, the discrimination against French Jews. So one of the things that Napoleon puts into place is religious freedom. That being said, Napoleon also works with the Catholic Church because a large number of people in France were Catholic. So many people didn't trust the fact that Napoleon hadn't had sort of a peaceful work with the church. So in 1801, Napoleon signs an agreement with the Pope, and it's called the Concordat of 1801, and it establishes that the Catholic religion could come back into France. But even more importantly than that, it establishes that there is equality for all religions, and Napoleon could make the appointments within the church. A couple of other things I just want to point out here about Napoleon's reforms. One thing that's really important about Napoleon's reforms is that he establishes the Bank of France. And the importance of the Bank of France is that it creates a common currency. It creates public debt. It's a way for people to sort of trust the financial institution of their country. It also establishes a national budget. So it unifies the different parts of France, and it says that the government now has credit to do different things within the country. So it establishes sort of a central location for people to look. The other piece that's really important here is Napoleon and his government establish their own state education. Everybody within France is entitled to free public education. And it was universal, right? Everybody within the country, boys, girls. It establishes the lycées. So the lycée schools are sort of famous today, and it's establishment of this. So these are the liberal reforms that Napoleon makes. These ideas are entrenched and enshrined in France by as late as 1805. All of these things happen almost immediately within the first 6 or 7 years of Napoleon coming to power. There's one other piece to this. Napoleon calls himself, at first, the first consul. Then he becomes consul for life. Then, in 1804, he declares himself the Emperor of France. When he does that, that is certainly a non-liberal, that is a conservative action. And as a result of that, Napoleon takes some decisive action in the next couple. So Napoleon goes on a massive military campaign after he declares himself emperor in 1804. And one of the things that Napoleon does is he extends the power of France. So you've instituted all these liberal reforms, education, banking system, civil laws, all of these things have happened, religious freedom, and now he starts expanding the power. And as the French army goes to all these different places, he is starting to show these ideas are traveling with the people, right? I'm sure you've heard the words of cultural diffusion. This is a cultural diffusion moment where his ideas start to spread. So and I'm jumping a bit, right? But by 1812 or 13, this is what the map of Europe looks like, right? The blue area of the map are places that are allies to France, right? These are sort of the loosest connections. We have an agreement that we are allies. But what's also important to see here is you have countries that are dependent on him. Napoleon actually creates the Confederation of the Rhine. The Rhine River is here. It's largely what would become Germany, although you also have parts of Italy, obviously. Switzerland, Poland. These are places that are they get their power through Napoleon. So Napoleon's brother has a crucial role in the Confederation of the Rhine. Napoleon's brother also has a power. Another brother has a power in Spain, obviously France. But then the green areas are places that Napoleon actually acquires. And you'll notice that Rome is there. So Napoleon winds up sort of annexing the Vatican, which is kind of interesting, right? I've made an agreement with you, but I'm now taking over power from you. So by 1814, let's say 1812, this is what Napoleon's Europe looks like. Napoleon has conquered with his grand army so much of Europe, and the ideas that Napoleon has instituted in France spread with his people. So those ideas of nationalism, that we are the French, or more importantly for people like the Germans and the Austrians, well, we are not French, we are Germans, we are Austrians, we are people who are different than they. The ideas of liberalism, education, civil laws start to spread. Napoleon is ultimately defeated because of a couple of things. Number one, he tries to invade Russia. So in 1812, the Napoleonic army goes east into Russia to try and take Moscow. The Russian army decides that they're going to stop Napoleon. So what they do is they have a scorched earth policy. Basically means burn everything to the ground. So they burn everything that the Napoleonic army can't use it, and Napoleon is ultimately forced to retreat. Napoleon is ultimately exiled twice. The first time he is exiled to the island of Elba, which is in the Mediterranean. He comes back into Europe for the 100 Days, and then he is finally exiled to St. Helena. He is finally defeated in 1815, and he's finally sent to St. Helena. We now, as a continent, a European continent, need to come together and figure out how are we going to resettle Europe, right? Europe has been a place that has been dominated by Napoleon over the course of the last couple of years, 10 years. How do we settle that? So there's a meeting that is called in the city of Vienna, which is the capital of Austria, by a guy named Clemens von Metternich. Now, Metternich calls this group of people, and this is Metternich here. And the point of this, so where Napoleon's actions were in many ways a liberal movement, pushing freedoms of equality, civil laws, equality before the law, religious freedom, economic toleration, these people come together at Vienna, and they are a reaction to that. This is a conservative meeting. And during this meeting, there is really in many ways trying to rewind the clock back to 1789. And we'll talk more about this when we come back in a couple of topics. But this establishes a conflict between liberalism and conservatism. And this moment here is going to stop fighting for a bit, but it's going to create discontent among the lower classes. So those are the major changes that happen as a result of Napoleon.